Experimental Art Foundation, EAF Statement, 1975. Experimental Art Foundation Archive, 1975. 1. Our appreciation of the world is active, not passive, and art displays an emergent apprehension. 2. Art is only incidentally and not essentially aesthetic. Art is concerned with every kind of value and not particularly with beauty. 3. Art interrogates the status quo. It is essentially and not incidentally radical. 4. Art is experimental action. It models possible forms of life and makes them available to public criticism. There has always been post-object art of some sort, and conceptual art as well, on some understanding of the term. What is new now is the extent and clarity of the recognition by artists of what they are manipulating need not be in the medium of oil, paint or stone, but may be a process, a system, or some other insubstantially and spatially or temporarily extended stuff. The entities that they generate are not, for the most part, medium-sized, portable, inflation-hedging lumps of cult furniture. Donald Brooke, Concepts Catalogue Essay, February 1974, Adelaide. Entities, the concepts and post-object exhibitions. Something incredible was happening in contemporary art in Adelaide in the 1970s and early 1980s. Local, national and international currents surged together in a heady mix of radicalism, idealism and a desire to edit the institution of art. All around the world, artists were challenging established structures and building their own. Alternative art spaces were formed by artists and art theorists, creating new spaces for artists to make, share and discuss work outside the stranglehold of conservative institutions and markets. Conceptualism, the belief that the most important part of an artwork was its idea, and the idea itself was sufficient to be an artwork, and the post-object movement, which foregrounded performance, film, installation, happenings and video, were twin currents animating the period. And Adelaide, despite or possibly even because of its peripherality, was the heartbeat of this movement. Entities, the concepts and post-object exhibitions, highlights the work of two related Adelaide art spaces, the Contemporary Art Society of South Australia, CAS, and the Experimental Art Foundation, EAF. The exhibitions signal key moments in the histories of the two art spaces and explore a pivotal juncture in the development of contemporary art locally and nationally. On the 9th of March 1974, the CAS opened the Concepts exhibition with a 3-week schedule of performances, lectures, film screenings and installations by a group of artists, including Tim Burns, Mike Parr, Aggie Reed and Ron Rowe, among others. Renowned Australian art theorist and co-founder of the influential artist-run space Tin Sheds, Donald Brooke had recently relocated to Adelaide and wrote in his introductory essay to the Concepts exhibition about the entities that artists in this conceptual post-object movement were now generating. Just weeks prior to the Concepts opening, plans to establish the EAF had taken shape. On the 5th of May 1976, the Foundation's first major exhibition, Australian and New Zealand Post-Object Show, a survey, opened showing work by 40 trans-Tasman artists. Emerging at a particularly active local moment, Concepts and the Australian and New Zealand Post-Object Show were influential in setting a new course for contemporary art in Australia. Comprising archival material drawn from public and private collections, the entities that they generate, the Concepts and Post-Object exhibitions, presents the tangible traces of an historic conceptual legacy. We are grateful for the energy, time and attention that a great many members of our community have contributed to the ongoing project of documenting, archiving and sharing ACE's archives. Photographer unknown. Installation view, Australian and New Zealand Post-Object Show, a survey at the Experimental Art Foundation, 1976. Gelatin silver photographs. Experimental Art Foundation Archive, 1976. On the 5th of May 1976, the Experimental Art Foundation, EAF, opened its first major exhibition, Australian and New Zealand Post-Object Show, a survey, with the work of 40 artists, including performance, installation, happenings, lectures, video, dance, photography and text. It was an ambitious undertaking, both in terms of its scale and scope, and established the EAF as a national and international focus for new and radically different art forms. The exhibition was co-curated by New Zealand artist Jim Allen, who had recently taken up a residency at the EAF, and Noel Sheridan, the EAF's founding director. Allen had organised the work of the New Zealand artists, while Sheridan had assembled the Australian artists' work. The exhibition was presented in the basement of an old jam factory at 169 Payneham Rd, St Peters, a space which was to house the EAF for 8 years. As the exhibition progressed, further work was contributed, and in the final week of presentation, the show was extended a further 3 weeks to the 18th of June 1976. Black and white photographs of the exhibition document the many performances and installations, lectures and happenings that took place in the shadowy, raw basement space, as well as the audience who can be seen sometimes crowding the space. Inspired by the physical characteristics of the basement and the history of the building, many artists made performance work in dialogue with the space, including Stellack in 1975 and Stuart Brisley in 1976. Philip Gurner's multifaceted work, Jam of Your Life, included in the Australian and New Zealand Post-Object Show a survey exhibition, similarly engaged, taking the history of the EAF building as its starting point. Gurner undertook extensive research into the history of the building, which had been originally established in 1911 for food processing and distribution, specialising in jams and canned fruit. Gurner requested the donation of homemade jam and jam recipes to be used in a durational performance titled Jam Tasting, whereby the artist was fitted with a nasal feeding tube and catheter. Over 36 hours, Gurner acted as a human jam tasting facility. I presented myself as a human loaf of bread. Quite a few people licked jam off me, recalls Gurner. Public response to the exhibition was mixed. Some people regard the post-object art that is practiced by members of the Adelaide's Experimental Art Foundation as deriving from spectacular intellectual confusion. Others regard it as highly stimulating, a new force, the new step forward. Even within some parts of the local art scene, the exhibition was met with much bewilderment and despair. Today, the exhibition serves as a record of the physical and intellectual vigour of the time and ultimately placed Adelaide at the heart of the post-object movement in Australia. Noel Sheridan, Experimental Art Foundation. Dear Post-Object People, 1974. Inkjet print on paper. Experimental Art Foundation Archive, 1976. Together these letters go some way in revealing the financial instability of the EAF at the time of establishment. The unsuccessful response to an Australia Council for the Arts grant application was reprinted in the January 1974 issue of the Sydney Cass Broadsheet, perhaps simply to notify interested parties, or perhaps as a useful mobilising force, prompting further action and support in an effort to ensure financial support. In the second letter there is an indication of positive news. We have unexpectedly received intimations that the situation might change. Ian North, who was involved in the establishment of the EAF, described the enthusiasm of the committee, and in particular of Bert Flugelman, that fuelled the group to keep going as long as we did. Following a successful reapplication in October 1974, the Visual Arts Board awarded a grant for a secretary's salary in addition to $5,000 towards the running costs of the foundation. In the early 1970s, the EAF was one of a number of alternative art spaces to find fiscal support to ensure the establishment and ongoing programming following the radical restructuring of the Australia Council for the Arts by the Whitlam Labor government. The EAF, IMA in Brisbane, ACP in Sydney and PICA in Perth were all established through the support from the Australia Council across a period of 3 years, between 1973 and 1975, constituting a significant period of fertile growth within the field. Photographer unknown, Pam Gilbert performance, Ritual Integration performance, 1976. Experimental Art Foundation Archive, 1976. The Australian and New Zealand Post-Object Show, a survey, was opened on May 5th at 8 p.m. Pam Gilbert's Ritual Integration performance was the exhibition's opening performance. The EAF's darkened basement provided an environment conducive to key notions evident within Gilbert's performance. Two figures dressed in white robes with ropes moved within a designated space, at times coming into contact with each other. Gilbert describes the performance. In this piece, the performers are used as extensions of their own shadow forms. This piece is the integration of two people together through their shadow forms, and or also two shadow forms together through the two performers. Although it is noteworthy that Pam Gilbert's ritual integration performance was the exhibition's opening night performance, only a small percentage of women were included in the exhibition. In her essay titled Women and Post-Object Art, Barbara Hall makes reference to this in relation to the broader context of the time. Sadly, the women students doing courses still graduate all but totally ignorant of women artists in history. It is also noticeable that there are very few culturally and linguistically diverse artists. Contemporary Art Society essay, Catalogue Folder Design John Copeland, Concepts Exhibition Catalogue 1974, Inkjet Print on Paper, Contemporary Art Society essay Archive 1974. Concepts opened on the 9th of March 1974 with a 3-week schedule of performances, readings, assemblages, lectures, video, film screenings and installations by a group of Sydney and Adelaide-based artists, including Tim Burns, Philip Gurner, Mitch Johnson, Tim Johnson, Tony Kirkman, Mike Parr, Aggie Reid, Ron Rowe, as well as others working collaboratively, Mary Osborne and Stuart McFarlane, Matthew Bienstock and Steve Haytner, among others. An official opening taking place on Sunday the 10th of March at 3 p.m. included an opening ceremony, the raising of the flag, a performance by jazz group Sylvan L. Hay and the Goblins, and a presentation by Environmental Visuals titled A Historical Gesture, in addition to performances and film screenings by Mike Parr, Ron Rowe and Tim Burns. Donald Brooke had recently relocated from Sydney to Adelaide to take up the position of Professor in Fine Arts at Flinders University when he was approached to write the exhibition's catalogue essay. Typical of Brooke's writing, the essay is heavily theoretical and philosophical in nature. With little reference to the exhibition's works or artists, the essay instead focuses on attributes relevant to conceptual art and Brooke's preferred term, post-object art. And I quote, "There has always been post-object art of some sort, and conceptual art as well, on some understanding of the term. What is new now is the extent and clarity of the recognition by artists that what they are manipulating need not be in the medium of oil, paint or stone, but may be a process, a system, or some other insubstantially and spatially or temporarily extended stuff. The entities that they generate are not, for the most part, medium, portable, inflation-hedging lumps of cult furniture." End quote. Donald Brooke, Post-Object Art, Concepts Catalogue, 1974. Included in the exhibition was a sculptural work by Ron Rowe titled Yalk Piece. Yalk Piece involved a mannequin placed on the floor of the gallery, clay, and invited audience participation. The idea was for people to participate by adding clay to or removing it from the figure. Over 4 weeks, I photographed the ever-changing image of Yalk with the sequence shown in a subsequent exhibition at the CAS. Ron Rowe. At the time, the exhibition caused both shock and amusement. Art critic David Dolan noted in an interview that Adelaide just hadn't seen this stuff before. It, the Concepts exhibition, was important because it was influential in establishing a chain of events that led to the establishment of the Experimental Arts Foundation. It was also very influential on students and the kind of work that art school students did. It also changed attitudes right across the board, and that includes the art public who went to the Art Gallery of South Australia and elsewhere. Noel Sheridan, editor. Broadsheet May, 1974. Contemporary Art Society essay, Archive, 1974. Prior to his relocation to Adelaide in December of 1974, Sheridan was editor of the Sydney CAS Broadsheet. In this issue, the Concepts exhibition is featured with double-page spreads exploring some of the artist's works, including Tony Kirkman's performance titled A Working Week, 1974.
Set out in a table, Kirkman details his daily intentions and activities, which are to take place while continuously remaining awake. On day 1, Kirkman petitions a room in the gallery using Monier Besser concrete blocks, an act referencing Kirkman's experience. In the May holidays 1971, I worked as a labourer for my uncle near Cabramatta. One of the tasks was to clean and stack bricks. This partition can be seen in the background of the photograph below. Kirkman's exhaustion ultimately brings about an early end to his performance, and is perhaps the perfect demonstration of the key themes the artist set out to explore. The working week was meant to create a unity between the individual works, whilst emphasising the element of time as being a controlling concomitant of both the nature and number of works that I could undertake.
Dean Bruton and David Dolan, Contemporary Art in South Australia and Oral History, 1985, State Library of South Australia collection. In 1985, Dean Bruton undertook a significant oral history project involving interviews with many who had contributed to the Contemporary Art Society S.A. As part of this project, Bruton interviewed art critic David Dolan. In this interview, Dolan speaks about concepts and its reception, as well as on the CAS more broadly. Dolan also recalls an amusing anecdote involving artist Ken Searle, giving insight into the creative antics taking place behind the scenes. 519. The most significant event of the early 1970s was the exhibition Concepts for the 1974 Festival of Arts. It was the first time Adelaide had seen art of that sort. 706. Concepts, was important because it was influential in establishing a chain of events that led to the establishment of the Experimental Art Foundation. 1526. Artist Ken Searle decided that although he wasn't one of the invited artists to the concept show, he'd make a contribution nonetheless. The interview continues to cover further exhibitions at the CAS and is included here for context.
RSA SA, Associate Contemporary Group. Catalogue cover design Douglas Roberts. First exposition Royal S.A, Society of Arts, Associate Contemporary Group. Exhibition Catalogue, 1942. National Library of Australia collection. In 1942, the first exposition Royal S.A, Society of Arts, Associate Contemporary Group exhibition took place following the rejection of their work by the Royal Society of Arts of South Australia, RSA SA. It was the first exhibition of the newly formed RSA SA Associate Contemporary Group, its members also comprising the recently founded Contemporary Art Society SA. This was a move away from the conservative establishment that was to eventually lead to the Contemporary Arts Centre of South Australia, CACSA. The accompanying exhibition catalogue reads as the group's manifesto, declaring art in South Australia to have been a dummy art founded on imitation of the past. The move away from the RSA SA results in the group, including Victor Adolfson, Ivor Francis, David Dowitz, Ruth Tuck, and Jacqueline Hick, being nicknamed Rebels. The exhibition caused significant controversy within the press and public. Ruth Tuck described the response as an uproar. Thousands of people attended it, mostly in shocked surprise.
Photographer unknown. Jam factory on Payneham Rd, St Peters, 1975. Inkjet print on paper. Experimental Art Foundation Archive, 1975. The Experimental Art Foundation, EAF, was born through the discussions of a small group of friends, including Bert Flugelman, Ian North, and Donald Brooke, as well as Richard Llewellyn, Clifford Frith, and Stephanie Britton in 1974. Established in an old jam factory on Payneham Road in St Peters, with fiscal support from the Visual Arts Board and the South Australian Government Department for the Arts, EAF was conceived as a church with a doctrine. The doctrine, as described by Brooke in a paper published by Art in Australia in the year following EAF's establishment, reveals a firm dedication to the conviction that the distinctive centre of the concept of art is the experimental role that it has in human life. Art, we believe, should not be conceived as a source of hedonistic pleasure or a theatre of self-expression, but as the arena of open experiment. A statement displayed in the foyer of the EAF and reproduced on the first page of A Decade at the EAF by Stephanie Bruton further explains the organisation's theoretical framework through 4 numbered declarations. EAF sought to provide a space for local, national and international artists to experiment without the perceived pressures or constraints of working within established institutions or commercial systems.
Jim Allen, Donald Brooke, Tony Colling, Winston Kernu, Graham Davis, John Davis, David Dolan, Barbara Hall, Philip Gurner, Kim Gray, Tim Johnson, Peter Kennedy, David Mealing, Michael Nicholson, Ken Searle, Noel Sheridan, Anne Stephen. Collection of writings and images from the unpublished post-object book, 1974 to 76. Experimental Art Foundation Archive, 1976. From the beginning, the EAF planned to produce a post-object book in association with the exhibition. Artists were asked to contribute text and or images for publication alongside key essays authored by Noel Sheridan, Donald Brooke, Anne Stevens, Winston Kernu and Peter Kennedy. These original essays are reproduced here. However, due to a lack of financial support, the book was never published. It is unknown how the book may have been structured and formatted, and whether further text and image submissions were to be included in the final proof had the book been published. The EAF went on to publish a number of artist books by Australian and international conceptual and performance artists, as well as establishing a lending library and artist books collection. Jim Allen, Bruce Barber, Graham Davis, John Davis, Benita Eli, Philip Gurner, Pam Gilbert, Kim Gray, Richard and Pam Larter, Moshikadam Dance Group. Installation View, Australian and New Zealand Post-Object Show, a survey at Experimental Art Foundation, 1976. Experimental Art Foundation Archive, 1976. This succession of slides provides a glimpse into the various performances, installations, film screenings, happenings, video, sculpture and dance, making up the Australian and New Zealand Post-Object Show, a survey exhibition. The Besser block plinth is itself a reference to Tony Kirkman's performance, A Working Week, presented as part of Concepts, in which the artist petitions a room in the gallery using Monier Besser concrete blocks. Tim Burns, Poster for Closed Room, number 2. Ask Me Anything About John Forbes, 1974. Contemporary Art Society SA Archive, 1974. Included in the Concepts catalogue were 2 exhibition posters by Tim Burns. The posters show documentation of his 2 works included in the exhibition, Ask Me Anything About John Forbes, 1974, and A Symphony for Black and Decker Power Tools, 1974. Ask Me Anything About John Forbes involved the poet John Forbes locked in a room under 24-hour CCTV surveillance for the duration of the exhibition. A 2-way real-time interaction between the audience and Forbes was enabled via a camera and monitor. The monitor, showing Forbes' activity inside the room, can be seen in the exhibition poster. It offered the audience the opportunity to find out anything they wanted to know about John Forbes by observing and conversing with the subject. Suspending the exhibition posters in this way is itself a reference to the Inhabridges Archive Department Information Centre Archive, 1974, by Mike Parr, also included in Concepts. The quasi-institutional archive established by Parr consisted of primary and secondary information gathered through correspondence with artists in North America and Europe and during travel to Europe in 1973. The information was set out on tables, hung on walls, and suspended on rope with pegs.